Welcome into another week of Dropping Dimes. I'm your host, Matt Nost, and I am joined by former NBA player, three-time book author. The books are Stories I Tell on Dates, Can I Keep My Jersey, and the newly published, is it your first novel, Bob Ballboy?
First fiction, baby.
First fiction came out earlier this month. Mr. Paul Shirley, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. How's the day where you are?
Well, considering we're only a few miles apart, it's pretty much the same.
You didn't have to tell them that. We could have pretended that this was an international production.
We could have.
I'm in Monaco and you're in Adelaide or something.
Sure. I love Australia in the summertime. It's beautiful here. Yeah. So look, my first question is, so right now the discourse, if you turn on ESPN, Fox, go to any kind of website, it devolves into MVP discussion. So my question is, as a guy who played on the Suns during Nash's one of his MVP runs, does that talk bleed into the locker room? Do you guys have a vested interest in it? And when does your opinion begin to form on that discussion?
I'm so glad you didn't ask me. I thought you were headed towards, so who should be the MVP this year? And that was going to be tough because I haven't watched an NBA basketball game in like 3 years. And I would have been like, all right.
It's so nebulous right now that you can make a case for like 5 different guys.
Great. So, cool. Because you could tell me, you could convince me of anything. When I was playing for the Phoenix Suns, which your listeners and viewers should know means that I was mostly watching the Phoenix Suns. I had a really great seat for the Phoenix Suns team of 2004, 2005, which was Steve Nash and Amari Stoudemire and Sean Marion and a bunch of other dudes.
Hell of a team.
Really good team. And as I can remember, most of the time people don't care about the MVP stuff. Like it just doesn't matter. I think it's a tired cliche maybe to compare it to battle, and that people don't like it when you do that.
Sure.
So it's maybe a better cliche is like, it's like being on a startup or something where you're just every day is we're just worried about like, how do we keep this thing going without running out of, in sports talk, it would be running out of like momentum or chemistry or whatever the thing is. Whereas if you were in business talk, you would be thinking about like capital or runway. And so I don't know I think the players care a little bit just from a like ego perspective, but they care a lot more about the ego boost of signing massive contracts. The MVP stuff is just sort of irrelevant. They know that's really I would probably liken it to winning an Oscar, where it's cool that I'm being talked about in those conversations. But they're also aware that there's a lot of nonsense behind the scenes as to who actually wins. What people care about. If you're a player, you care about just like, it's my team was better than your team, but also I was instrumental in making my team better than your team.
I mean, it's a interesting point that you guys don't really buy into the full discussion, and it's not a topic of conversation really within the locker room itself. Does that also hold for like All-Star and All-NBA?
In my experience, yes. I think there's a bit of a combative relationship between media and players, at least. And again, we have to remind people that like it's been 15 years now, so I don't want to speak for what things are like exactly today, but I would assume that some of this stuff is fairly universal. A lot of media members often have a little bit of a chip on their shoulder as far as like if you're a writer, and like I am a writer, so I understand this mindset. Like you also want to be the center of attention, and now you're forced to kind of like cede the attention to the player. And a lot of times there's a bit of a weird relationship between those two ego systems going, right? So like the player doesn't really trust the sports writer because they're like, he kind of wishes he were me, and vice versa. And so I think like players know that a lot of these things that get voted on are done by media members, and some players have like good relationships with members of the media, and others have really awful ones, and they care a lot more about their street cred than they do their credibility with members of the media. So I think that means that the fans might be thinking like, oh, these guys really give a shit about this. The players, some of them might, the ones that are a little more polished when it comes to like just being sort of politically correct or media friendly. But a lot of them are just like, all I care about is like, do the other players respect me? And am I going to sign a massive contract after this year?
Okay, well, on the flip side of that coin, so then when someone is awarded, say, MVP, All-NBA, All-Star, is there a discussion of, well, God, this guy deserved it over, you know, X over Y type of thing? Or how does this person get snubbed? And this one keeps getting elevated year in, year out, when I have to play these individuals or we have to game plan, it's not even a discussion as to who we fear most.
I think it's probably mostly the case that a guy would use that as fuel.
Okay.
He doesn't really care about the actual like, oh, my name was in USA Today as second team All NBA. But what he cares is about like his perception of his relative worth compared to one of those other guys. So if he feels like I'm better than that guy and he's getting all of these accolades, he's not really gonna like care about the newsprint. What he's going to care about is, how do I use this to sort of take it out on this guy?
Okay. So yeah, motivation to basically destroy them the next time they see him. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think I got to interview for this podcast I do around the process, which is this business I've just started. I got to interview a professional wrestler named John Moxley recently. Okay. He was Dean Ambrose when he was in the WWE. And we talked a lot about the perspective from like the wrestler's point of view versus the fans' point of view. And it was particularly fascinating for me because I always contended that the NBA is a lot closer to professional wrestling than people realize.
Okay.
So like,
how so?
So the fans have a certain perspective, like kind of what we're talking about here. Like the fans would probably assume that guys care about who gets named to the All NBA team or whatever.
Okay.
When the players are really pretty sequestered into this job of playing the games, but also providing entertainment. We always have to remember that the job is to be entertaining. It's not just that you can go out and play basketball and that's the end of it. So a lot of things like who gets voted to a certain all-star team or all NBA team, or who's in the dunk contest, that has much more to do with pleasing the fans, right? Getting people to turn on their television. Yeah. Some guys might be more effective basketball players, but they're just like not that fun to watch, or they don't play on a team that anybody cares about. And I think players know that. It can be frustrating, but you also just have to understand that you've kind of signed up for this ride. And I think like within that, it's helpful to sometimes remember that the business isn't just one team against the next. It's the NBA versus the NFL. So the NBA's job is to pit all of its players, however they can, against these other attention grabbers. Yeah. So there's this like tension that's happening between, we've got to keep it competitive and looking like a sport, but we're also trying to make sure that what we're packaging is more interesting than your phone or the NHL or whatever the thing is. And I think that's sometimes hard for people to realize when they are devoted fans of a particular team, right? They're like, well, why doesn't my team do X, Y, or why don't they respect my team? Well, because the NBA doesn't really care which team is at the top, as long as that team is pulling in ratings and viewers and fans. And I think that's sometimes hard for people to understand that there's an understanding on the player's part that like, yes, I'm competing, but also I'm entertaining. It's not quite like professional wrestling, but it's more like professional wrestling than people maybe want to know.
No, I think that's entirely true. I mean, look at the rules changes within the NBA to get away from defensive-minded squads to let's open up the scoring because that's more entertaining for a casual fan and we can get more eyeballs. Because as you said, we're competing for a very specific pie of sports viewing audience. and we want to cut into the NFL's lead on everybody else and basically put the baseball to sleep and NHL and everybody else below us and try and reach number one.
Yeah.
Expand out international markets, etc.
You mentioned an interesting point about like the rules changes. We all enjoy fast-paced sports. The thing the NBA has done that has made it, in my mind, unwatchable is that now everybody plays the same way, and the teams that are good or are sort of favored at the beginning of the year are almost always going to win. And that causes some real issues when it comes to the long-term viability of things. Like the NFL has it so nailed when it comes to the parity of things, of just knowing like, my team is probably bad, but we might win 3 games in a row. And then suddenly like everything is going to be okay. So I find the NBA largely unwatchable because of that aspect, that like, there aren't any surprises. And I think that's because of they've swung so far to there's only one way to win or to play. That makes it really impossible for anybody else to kind of contend. Like in the NFL, right? You could have a team that grinds it out and is going to win 10 games and lose 6, and they're mostly reliant on defense. And they may actually end up playing in the Super Bowl because that's just like, they might just wind their way through.
Yeah.
Whereas you can have a team like my hometown Kansas City Chiefs that are just going to air it out, and like that could be effective as well. Right now, the NBA has committed so fully to one style of play that it's really hard for the lower ranked teams, I guess, to have a chance.
I mean, it would take tremendous rules changes at this point. You'd have to eliminate corner threes. You need to do all these things to basically reduce what you're saying, which is the similarity within playing styles.
At some point, they have to take away the 3-point line. That's the only fix, really.
I think either that or extend.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, it's a kind of. I mean, it was a rule put in place to do one job, and it has done its job. And now it's a really perverse incentive that is unlike any other sport. You know, it'd be weird if there were like a second fence in baseball, and if you hit it over that second one, you get 2 runs.
Well, yeah, true. But I think now, I mean, there's so much excitement around these long shots from guys, and they've created an entire generation of individuals that want a gun from 3-point range. So I don't envision a world in which they get rid of this. So they have to tweak it if they're going to try and change.
Yeah,
and reduce the homogenous style.
From a basketball player's standpoint, from a super purist's standpoint, fundamentally a longer shot should be easy enough because the defender has to stay away from you in case you go around them, right? There's just so much more space. So that should be advantage enough. You could still, there's plenty of chances to take long shots that are difficult.
Sure.
It's just that's just weird that they're worth more. And I think they will figure that out in the next 5 to 10 years, or like the NBA really suffers because college basketball is so popular. These other sports have it kind of more dialed in. So like I just find it fascinating, especially as someone who played in professional sports, that everyone assumes that every professional sport will always be around. If we were alive 100 years ago or 200 years ago, like this stuff it's not necessarily inherent that the NBA is popular, much like, arguments have been made about boxing, car racing. Like there's lots of things that kind of ebb and flow.
Sure.
And I think like it's actually really interesting how complacent some of these leagues can get, because they're just like, well, it's been this way for a long time, so we just have to keep doing it.
Yeah, just the heritage, the way it's always been type of thing. Although I do think the NBA is willing to tweak and advance and try and tweak things as they go along to make it better overall, as opposed to something like baseball where, look, it's been this way for so long that the traditions now are these big, immovable objects, and you can't, there's all these unspoken rules and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that's interesting that, you fear for the long-term longevity of the sport if it doesn't make certain tweaks and try and update. I'd be curious to see how many people are like you that have now fallen off, because I hear that every once and again where it's all the same. Everybody plays the same, and it's not as engaging. But I think a case could be made where in the 90s it was all ISO ball and bang down low, and that got kind of boring and routine.
Yeah.
So there's been a shift from that. We'll see where the shift is, in the next 5 to 10 years.
Well, I think some of it is that it's difficult to attach an identity to teams when they all have the same identity.
Sure.
I think, I've railed about this a bunch in my life, that one of the things the NFL does so well is it gets people to buy into, and baseball's basically the same as this. You buy into, like, I am a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers or the Cincinnati Reds. And it kind of doesn't matter who plays for the team. Like, I'm always going to be a fan of them. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't really translate it to the NBA. There's a lot more like, I'm a fan of this player, and I'll sort of follow him around. And that problem with that is that players get hurt and or their careers end. And that is it's a short-term win a lot of times, but it does not work as well in the long term. And I think that's additionally where the NBA loses out to college basketball. So we always have to forget that there's this elephant in the room of college sports are so popular, and they're also, like, as they say, every year they're graduating like 4,000 or 5,000 more fans. It's this machine that keeps itself going. And there's an identity attached, like, well, I went to the University of Michigan, so these are the sorts of people that we are. Well, I went to the University of Indiana, and these are the sorts of people we are. And that tribal identity is really valuable and helpful for kind of propelling things forward. That works a lot like the tribal identity of, I'm a Steelers fan. And I don't know that you have that if you're like, I'm a Pacers fan. Like, who cares? Nobody's like, oh, well, that says something about you.
Well, I think choosing the Pacers of all teams undercuts the argument you were just making. Had you said, because I agree with you in that being a fan of an individual player now is much more prevalent. And you see, like, look at LeBron. How many fans went from Cleveland to Miami, back to Cleveland, and now are Lakers fans because they're LeBron fans. And the age of, player empowerment, where there's a chance they're going to move every 2 to 4 years. It's easier to latch onto a player for some of these young kids as opposed to a team. Although someone like the Pacers, I think that is very much a team culture kind of identity area, but other franchises don't have that, per se. But, we'll see in 5 to 10 years if they are struggling, because I don't see the NFL's popularity waning anytime soon. It just has such a grasp, and it's far and away number one. So everybody else is fighting for number 2 in this country, at least. And right now, I would imagine the NBA basically has that on lock, at least by TV ratings. But in 5 to 10 years, who knows where we're going to go from there?
Well, again, I think, like, it's not really just, it's more like, I don't know the exact numbers, but I would say it's the NFL's first, college football second, college basketball is next. The NBA is competing with college basketball. Like, it is sort of a feeder sport, but it's competition because it's still eyeballs and time. And I think, like, I used to talk about how it was crazy. People would say that the NBA was boring and that college basketball was better. And I'd be like, that's an insane thing to say, because, like, obviously the players are better, but you can see it because there's just so much more pageantry attached to college sports. And I think that there's just something about that draws people in. And it's really difficult in the NBA to pull that off, especially because like, there are just too many games. It gets boring even as a player. You're like, where are we? Like, what does this game in the middle of February have to do with anything? And I think that
with money,
it does, but I think it's weird because it's like again, it's kind of short-termism. The NFL does really well because it has fewer games, because, like, each game is an event.
Yes.
The baseball does really well because it has so many games. So 81 home games times whatever the, like, average attendance is adds up really quickly. The NBA is kind of in this middle ground where there's too many games, but not enough games for it to really be just about the money grab of the attendance, the physical attendance. And nobody's watching, I don't know, the Kings play the Mavericks on a Wednesday night, like in the world. I mean, they might watch if it's, if the Raiders played the Texans on a Thursday night football game, people are going to watch even if they're not fans of those teams. And I think that's where the NFL has done really well.
I mean, I'll be intrigued how the NFL does over the next few years, just because they've got the Thursday game. They're talking about rolling out more nights, and it's, to me, going to dilute what is the singular interesting part of your sport. It's really about Sunday and that one game on Monday, and now we have the Thursday game, which pretty much sucks week in, week out.
It is peculiar as somebody who like watches a lot of Chiefs games. Like the fact that they will have like these great games paired off against each other is bizarre.
Yeah, they do a terrible job of scheduling.
So like it seems like figuring out a more flexible schedule would be really smart for them, where, you know, we have 2 games on Thursday, 2 games on Monday, 1 game on Saturday night, and then these games on Sunday are sort of like somehow staggered. Because of fantasy football, right? Like people are willing to watch games that aren't just necessarily their teams. And it seems like at some point they'll have to crack that.
Yeah. All right. Well, shifting off of this. So you played 3 years in the league, and then you played for 5 different teams internationally. But 1 in Russia, 3 in Spain, and then 1 in Greece. Is that right?
Yeah. Good call.
What is... So this is, I watch a lot of movies, right? And I do 2 other movie podcasts. If you want to come on and do movie podcasts, those. Yeah.
I just last night watched because you can go to theaters. I watched this movie Chaos Walking.
Oh yeah, I have not seen that.
It's not good. Not good.
Well, what's coming out in theaters right now?
Yeah,
a whole lot of not good.
It was. It's kind of an amazing backstory that it's based on like a YA trilogy. And they started shooting in 2017 with Daisy Ridley and Tom Holland. And then in 2019 or 2018-19, they decided like this is unreleasable and had to reshoot a bunch of stuff, which is always a bad sign.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's so much a mess. The point of the movie was not the movie. It was like, we can go to a movie and that'll be fun.
Yeah.
And it was like a spectacle, and that was cool. But watching it and then realizing learning that it cost $100 million to make this absolute turd of a movie was staggering, where you're like, everybody who's involved in that movie should never work again. It's it's always amazing to me when people get jobs again after something like that.
You watched $90 million get lit on fire is what you did. They'll make about 10 back after the streaming and everything like that. But so my thought was, so it's easy to say, okay, what are the big differences between the NBA and these internationals? But in terms of Moneyball, if you've ever seen that, when David Justice goes from the Yankees to the A's, and he goes up to the vending machine and was like, I gotta fucking pay for my soda. Like that was the biggest shock to him of this is so. What are the tiny differences between the 2 leagues where just to bang it home of, oh yeah. When you're in Greece, it's completely different. We're used to 5-star accommodations here in the NBA and you know, the best travel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But room service costs X or whatever the case is.
Well, I mean, I was so much a mercenary journeyman / marginal professional athlete that I got to see many degrees of this. So when I was I played in the CBA, which is now defunct, for the Yakima Sun Kings in Yakima, Washington. And I lived in the Cedars Inn and Suites, which was a motel. Like the
sounds beautiful.
Doors are to the outside, and I had a mini fridge and a microwave on top of it. And I was making $700 a week, and I had to like buy an old car for $50 to drive around Yakima. So I went from that one year to getting called up to the NBA by the Atlanta Hawks, which was quite the change, right? I had actually been in training camp with the Hawks. So training camp, everything's the best.
Sure.
Off to Yakima, everything is way worse than college. Like we're overnight buses that like the heating would break down when we're like traveling between Bismarck and Sioux Falls. Like
it's like
just
the NBA
like
in the 50s.
Yeah, like it's a minor league baseball kind of situation. Nobody's really getting paid. You get fined $100 for a technical foul, and that's like, you know,
1/7 your pay.
1/20 of your pay for the month or something. So that was just like, I don't know what I'm doing with my life, and I need to quit playing basketball. Then I get called up by the Atlanta Hawks. I have a 10-day contract that's worth $30,000, right?
Yeah.
That's a life-changing sum of money. And then I get cut and go to Spain. And then Spain served as kind of like an equalizer. It was not the NBA, but it was also not Yakima. I was like, as part of your contract of playing overseas, you always get an apartment in it. It's just like an apartment that they just have for whomever is their foreigner. It's a little bit like a comic apartment, like when you go on the road and there's
the comic condo.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of like that in a way. I mean, it's nice enough.
Oh yeah, hopefully it's nicer than most comic condos.
It's nicer than what I've learned about those. Yes, and I think the big change, though, honestly, is when you're on the road, you have a roommate, and that's so different from the NBA, where you're like, well, I'm a grown up and I'm gonna sleep in a room by myself, and then you get to Europe, and not only are you sleeping with another human, but in most European hotel rooms, there are 2 twin beds that are right next to each other in a room that's a quote double. So you always have to go through this ritual as these 2 giant men of going into your room and pulling the beds apart and then like putting the end table between them to just give yourself a little bit of privacy.
Yeah.
Which feels kind of like homophobic or something. Like, well, I couldn't dare like sleep right next to this guy, but then again, you're like, I don't want to sleep next to this guy. Like,
I would do the same. Weird. I don't think it's homophobic at all. It's like, you want your space.
Yeah, you need a little space, and it's also like, it's always strange to me. I mean, I love European like design and style, and so those hotel rooms would always be put together really well. But you're like, why is there just 2 tiny twin beds? Like, it's so strange. Like,
as someone who's traveled a decent amount, like finding a queen bed, sometimes near impossible. Like, all right, we're sleeping on a double tonight, or we're sleeping on a full.
Yeah, there's a lot of those things that are still true about Europe that I love about it, that I also kind of miss, like the idea of like, it's really hard to get ice still. It sounds like my mom talking about like going to Europe in the 1960s or 70s, but that's true. There's also the problem in Europe of getting paid. When I was in Greece, my contract for the year was for $100,000. Pretty cool, because I was fresh out of college and I was like, whoa, $100,000 is a lot of money. Well, I actually only got paid $52,000 because the Greek team just sort of stopped paying us middle of the year, and got real weird about things. They even when they were, I got one check, like I was going to say check, but that's not really true. I got one payment in full, and that was the first payment I was supposed to get. And it was, I was probably a harbinger of things to come, because they gave me before practice an envelope with $12,000 in cash. That was my
doesn't seem
pay.
Sketchy at all.
Yeah, it's totally reasonable.
It's legitimate.
And I was like, thank you for paying me, but like, what am I going to do with this while I practice? Because our locker room was legitimately one cube that was about 15 by 15 feet with 3 benches, no lockers, and then a shower that nobody went into because it was just filled with fungus and
hadn't been cleaned.
So while practice went on, I just had to put $12,000 in one of my shoes and hope that nobody stole it. And thankfully they didn't. But there was no I was like, great guys, but what am I supposed to do with this? And then I'm carrying around $12,000 like, I guess, well, I'll go get a Greek bank account, I guess.
I love it. I had no idea that on some level that type is so similar to being a road comic. I've done gigs where people told me beforehand, as soon as he pays you, go deposit that check. As soon as he pays you, be like, really? No, he'll blow the money by Wednesday.
It was like, I come from a family of mostly like medical types, like doctors. And
my dad's a doctor, my mom's a nurse. I got you.
My parents are both like, they work for the state of Kansas. Nobody in my family had ever played college basketball, or college sports at all. So like, this was such an education, like learning about all this. My mom has heard so many like, well, should I do this? Or like just debates about weird stuff that was going on when I got out of Greece. So the team had paid me half of what they owed me. And so we sued them, right? We're like, well, guys, we have a contract. Like, it's not up for debate.
Yeah. But what I know of Greece, good luck.
Yeah, true. So we won the lawsuit, and they appealed, and we won the appeal. And then the Greek minister of sport said to all the teams that were in arrears, we'll forgive you your debts as long as you promise to never do this again. And you have to change your team's name. That was it. So they changed. My team was called Peñoños. They changed it to like Peñoños 1921, which was the year of their founding. And so this was like maddening and infuriating, especially because like what people don't, I think, know about professional basketball. It's a lot like tennis, where like the best of the best are going to be set for life, but then everybody else is kind of just fighting. You know, I averaged making $80,000 a year for 9 years or something like that, which is cool. I mean, I got paid to play a game, but it's not going to set you up. Like I'm hard scrabbling, living in an apartment. Like I just, whatever. We'll talk about that later. But so that was maddening in and of itself. But that same year I was talking about, when I went to training camp with the Atlanta Hawks, my Greek team calls and says, hey, Paul, so we'd like to exercise the option on your contract. So they had an option on the second year of my deal at $150,000, right? And I'm like, what? Like, we had to sue you to try to get money from you. Like, obviously the clause about the option is like null and void. And they're like, no, we're going to exercise. I'm like, it's like being gaslighted by somebody. You're just like, that's so crazy that I can see it's almost making me feel crazy. And so I remember saying, look, you wire me the $50,000 you owe me or whatever, and then we can talk. And they were like, what about this? What about we exercise the option and then we'll wire you 25 right now. And then as the season goes on, we'll build in those other payments. I'm like, that's crazy. Like, no, of course not.
You should have just changed your name to Paul Shirley 1921 and be like, different guy. I don't know.
Different guy, new contract.
Yeah.
Another team, speaking of changing my name, another team in Greece offered me a contract that was for 3 years. I think it was 3 years. The first year was like, let's say 120. Second year was 150. Third year was 180. And it would result in me getting a Polish passport.
Why?
Because in Europe, like, you can only have 2 Americans most of the time.
There's a rule.
It's kind of changing. Some of these leagues are different now, but at the time it was 2 Americans. So if you are a good basketball player who also has a European passport, you become way more valuable, right?
Sure.
Because then they don't have to use one of their spots. So basically, they were, as I learned later, they were going to pay the Polish government like $50,000 to just give me a passport. And I was always like curious, like, would I be Paul or would I be Pavel? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm not sure. I don't think Paul is a Polish name.
Wow. So, and then you turned them down, obviously, because you didn't.
Well, but I considered it. That's what's so weird about playing professional sports is you're like, I don't know, maybe. Well, there's weirder things that happen.
Yeah, sure. And that passport, if it's legitimate, if you could get it, that would. Right. I could see the upside of, well, all right, now I have better job security.
Totally. I mean, I might. That's what their offer was. Like, well, look, we have to have you commit for 3 years, but once you have that passport, then you're making a bunch more money and you have a lot more job security. When I played in Russia, the Russian league had a rule where there had to be 2 Russians on the court at all times.
Wow.
Which makes for some like weird substitution patterns.
Yeah, rotations don't make sense.
But it also just gives those Russian guys so much job security. Like, if you're among the 25 best Russian basketball players, you're like, you can't tell me anything, because they got to put somebody out there. It's like union rules, basically.
Yeah. So of the 3 international leagues that you played in, which was your favorite? I'm assuming Spain, but I don't know. Spain
is the best. It's the most well run. At the time I was playing, it had some of the best teams in Europe with Real Madrid and FC Barcelona, but it was more that it was like of higher quality from top to bottom. Like, the Russian league had Cheska or CSKA, which is like
that's their number one,
a Euro League team. And again, like, the Greek team had Panathinaikos and Olympiakos, and the Turkish league had a couple of teams that were always in the Euro League, and there's Maccabi Tel Aviv in Israel.
Sure.
But the Spanish league just was well run all the way through, had at the time, I'm not sure if this is still true, but like 18 teams, and it was like they were spread out throughout the country in a little more reasonable and rational way. So it was very much the second best league in the world.
Yeah, that's all I've ever heard about it is this is as close to the NBA as you can get outside of the NBA. The competition is all excellent. They've got great players. It's well run. I've only seen, pieces of games here and there. I don't follow that league specifically, but all right. So that's number one. Are we saying Greece or Russia is number two?
The Greek league was entertaining because of that. I used that word of pageantry earlier. There was just so much fury in the Greek fans' heart. Lots of my home games would have more riot police than fans because they had such a history of like doing dumb shit, like throwing stuff onto the court. When I was playing there, several times I had stuff thrown at me. But there was a game between Panathinaikos and Olympiacos where fans they had brought Roman candles into the gym and were shooting them at the fans across the court, which I found to be fairly amazing. And there they would like rip chairs off and wing them onto the court or go to the bathroom and break a piece of concrete off and chuck that at players. So that like slight fear for your life, I think, added to the pageantry.
Motivates a little bit more. Yeah, gets a little more out of the players. So in the chat, someone asked, who had the best food?
Matt, we were talking before the show a little bit about Spain. Yeah. This is real boring, but I didn't understand what Spanish food was before I went to Spain, or even for the first year that I lived in Spain. And here's the key. Spanish food is just better ingredients, I think. Like it's weird because like there's no spice. It's not like Italian food. We're like, oh, there's basil and oregano. This is Italian now.
Yeah.
Spanish food is more just like we do the same thing every time. There's some sauteed mushrooms. There's some bread and tomatoes. There's some Iberian ham. But it's all so like well put together, and there's like a social element to it that took me a long time to grasp. So even though Greek food is just so good, I think the Spanish attitude toward food is so much more up my alley.
Yeah, I prefer. I haven't been to Spain. I think it's the best food that I've had in Europe, just consistently. You can go anywhere and be like, boom, this place is great. I love 3 things on this menu.
Yeah, they'll just be like, here's a steak, and the only seasoning was salt. Get into it, and it'll be like the best steak you had in 2 months. It's peculiar how, like, as an American, I was spoiled and also dumb and just like didn't
uneducated.
Understand. Yeah. I just didn't understand. Like I had never been to Europe before I went to Greece to play. So I was just getting this education on the fly of like, what are these countries like, and what does Spanish food mean?
I know, but there's one thing for those listening or watching, never been. It is like, hey, you want ham on that? We got 7 different kinds of ham. Be like, right. I am hammed out, man. Yeah. I can't. Oh, this one has been aging for 7 years, and be like, I don't really give a shit at this point. I've had a lot of ham. Yeah,
it's kind of like one thing I learned about the Spanish language is, and you've probably seen this, where when we greet each other here in the U.S., we might say any number of things like, "Hey, how's your day?" or "What's going on?" whatever. But like in Spain, they say "Buenos dias" like basically all the time. And if you depart from that, they're like, "What are you doing?" So there's like certain kind of cultural norms when it comes to how you greet people, how you say goodbye. And I think that carries over into the food, where you're like,
okay,
so I want something besides like ham and tomato on this like bocadillo, this sandwich. And they're like, not interested. We can't do that. We don't have that in our repertoire.
It's all the same. It's just varying. I mean, it's good. It is good, but it's like
good. It's good, but
after a while, it's like I can't take it again.
Like, yeah, we would be, because we spend a lot of time in airports, right? And we'd be in airports at these cafes, and you're like, "Do you have anything else besides fucking ham sandwich? I cannot take another ham sandwich."
The weirdest thing is the looks you get when you're carrying around a coffee. Just because I'm so accustomed here, you go get a cup of to-go coffee, and everybody else is like, I drink my coffee at. I found that more in Italy than Spain per se, but Spain was still like, you'd get a weird look every once and again of like, why are you walking around with a drink? Like, I don't know, because I get thirsty.
There's a lot of, it took me a really long time in Greece to just kind of settle into the speed of things.
Okay.
It was a really good education, and one I often forget just about, like, while it was frustrating to not get paid, they had a lot to say about just the pace of life and like kind of slowing down. And, you know, I make this joke about, like, they would, the Greek word for tomorrow is avrio. And so I would be like, okay, so when am I going to get paid? And they say avrio. And then the next day I'd be like, okay, so I'm here. Where's my money? And they're like, oh, avrio malaka. They would be like, they would say tomorrow, but they really just mean sort of like someday. Yeah. And I think that was kind of their attitude toward like everything. Like, you know, we'll get, the game will start at some point. Maybe the referees will show up. I don't know. And as a really type A person who struggles with like slowing down, I fought against that. And I think it was, but it was, I think, a good lesson for me. And just like, oh, they're probably enjoying life a lot more than you are, Paul.
Yeah, but it's also, I think, too, coming into it, there's certain expectations where I get paid on this day, and you have a routine as an athlete. Just like I get up, I work out, I go have my meal, I do, you know, X, Y, Z throughout the day. So that laissez-faire kind of attitude is great for general life, but just like, I need a routine to some degree, especially when it comes to getting paid. That would be nice.
Yeah. But, well, yeah. I mean, I think we were talking a little bit beforehand about like building a process, whether it's stand-up comedy or public speaking or writing or basketball. A lot of times what you're doing when you set up these habits and routines is eliminating variables. You know, like, okay, before games, here's my routine. I need to do this, 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 and this, and that'll probably get me in the right kind of mindset to be able to like perform at this level. And when you start like adding in potential hiccups, it then means you're like devoting cognitive energy to those other things. That's why, like, you know, people make fun of riders for rock bands, but like that's why they have like these very set kind of routines, because they have to make everything kind of the same. Like whether you're in Minneapolis or Phoenix, you need to know I can count on this kind of food or this kind
of sort of normalcy
arrangement. Yeah. And I think that like that's one thing that got thrown off a lot in Europe was just this, like, what is happening? Where are we? And how am I supposed to get back to this job of like concentration?
Speaking of routines, did you ever have a teammate have a pregame routine? Because I've heard over the years, like certain guys have to use the restroom at a very specific time. Or there was one where a guy would get sick before playoff games. But it was just part of his just getting the nerves up and out. Do you encounter any of that? Because I think I'd be taken aback. I don't have any of those personally, but I also haven't been in those high leverage situations where 15,000 people are showing up to watch me perform.
Right. It's, I think that a lot of times what we consider superstition is really this idea of building a system that you can count on. I had a college teammate who one time the bathrooms were full, so he peed in the sink, which was disgusting because everybody had to wash their hands in that sink. But then he just started doing that every time because he liked it, I think.
Did he have a good game after he did it the first time?
I think he must have had some mental connection to like, this is what I do. And you know, there's all this stuff that like we've heard 1,000 times of guys wearing like, well, this was my high school t-shirt that I wear under my college jersey. There's so much of that. And I, in retrospect, understand that I had a lot of those. You know, I would freak out sometimes. Like I'd be stretching before a game and I would like lose track of my count. And I'd be like, oh God, that means I'm not concentrating. This is going to be a terrible game today. Yeah. I think it should never be underestimated how obsessive compulsive, high level athletes are, because that's how you get to that level. And on some level is just like being a weirdo. And that can play out in like the ways that people set up these habits and routines, and they'll say things that seem crazy. Like, oh, my Gatorade is in a different spot, so I can't function. And you're like, that's nuts, man. But it's also part of what makes people good at what they do. That's why like Zach Greinke, right, is a complete nut job, but that's part of what makes him like a great pitcher, is being a complete nut job.
Yeah, it's just they're used to, that's how their brain functions. And this is, I put these things in this order and it gets me kind of mentally built up to go and perform at whatever level that I perform at. So on the outside, it's like, oh, that's strange. But at the same time, once you hear, it's like, oh, I do this. Like, it makes more sense. Or you hear like Ray Allen goes out and shoots from this spot so many times, that spot so many, and just like the Einsvi nature of it. Like, yeah, but that's how he dials in to do what he does. Like, okay, it doesn't sound as crazy once you hear the full crazy, basically.
Yeah, I was watching, I don't know what, some basketball related thing, and have this real, like, at some point somebody's going to figure out that the way that basketball teams do warm-ups is wrong. Right now it's like guys just come out and like shoot these like very casual layups. But before the fans have gotten there, they've probably gone through a full workout almost, just like getting ready for the game. Like you said, hitting shots from certain spots. And at some point, somebody's going to figure out like, it would be a lot better if we had our guys just like ready to go at tip off so that they could then engage more fully. There's kind of this like gentleman's agreement of like, well, tip off first couple plays are going to be a little slower. And somebody at some point will realize like, oh, we should be going full bore at tip off. And so therefore like run warm-ups a different way so that it's a lot more like
do the inverse, the easy layup line into the more stringent shooting drills and whatnot.
Thankfully, I'll never be a coach, so we don't have to worry about anybody putting that into play right now.
Well, you never know. Never say never. What if in 5 years you're like, I got the bug. I want to get back in. What was it when you got to the league? So you were a walk-on in college you went undrafted and eventually, I mean, that to me is even more impressive than the guys on some level that are anointed early on, just to keep kind of pushing and being like, I know I can play. I know that I can do this. And then once you finally make it to the NBA, what is that like? How much quicker is the game than you anticipated, or is it as quick as you anticipated? Are the players as athletic as you anticipated, or even more so? Like, was it a wake-up call? And I guess also on the flip side of that, do they properly acclimate rookies and new guys coming in to the rigors of the game?
I was fortunate to get to play at such a high level in college because I played at Iowa State in the Big 12, and we were really good. Like we went to we were a 2 seed my junior and senior year in the NCAA tournament and won the Big 12 both.
I remember.
years.
I'm a Bulls fan. We took Pfizer. I remember those teams. Yep.
So the much bigger jump was from high school to college. That was like, my freshman year, I was guarding Kelvin Cato, who went on to make $60 million in the NBA, on the first play of the first pickup game I ever played in. And of course he like came to the free throw line, spun out and dunked on my head. And so that was the real wake up call of like, I think by my, sophomore, junior, senior year, I might be able to figure this out, but like it's a long way off right now. Okay. By the time I got to the NBA, especially because there were a lot of guys, that was, my senior year of college was 2001. And so I can vividly remember summer league with the Cleveland Cavaliers guarding Tyson Chandler, who had just either that year or the year before been picked by the Bulls. Right. And getting on the wing against Tyson Chandler and realizing he had no idea how basketball worked. That like
he didn't need to at that point. I'm saying his size, he got drafted, straight out of high school because of just how huge he was.
But like I had played 5 years of college because I redshirted, which for those listening means that I sat out a year, just practiced, didn't play. And so I'm like, I still had 3 or 4 more years before I would really grow into my body, but I understood basketball really well. And that actually meant that it was not as much a surprise that I was able to worm my way into the NBA as it was a surprise that I was able to worm my way into playing a lot in college after not being recruited out of high school. I think playing around other pros in college, like Marcus Fizer, like Jamal Tinsley, like Kelvin Cato, all these guys, meant that I was prepped for a pretty high level coming out. And then it was a matter of like, I'm 6'9" and I weigh 230 pounds. Like, I'm a pretty big dude.
Yeah.
I was not big enough to be a big guy in the NBA, but I at least understood like where to be on the court enough that I wasn't, Marcus suffered because he's probably only 6'5" or 6'6", right? So like,
yeah,
he was a dominant college basketball player, but he just wasn't quite tall enough and long enough to like fly around, where I was not at all dominant in college, but I was tall enough where you could put me in places and I'd figure it out. I wasn't nearly as good an NBA basketball player as Marcus, but I was blessed by this background and also by like just being tall enough and like athletic enough that I could like sort of make my way.
What is that process like of walking on in college? Do you just show up and be like, listen, I can play?
It was kind of it was a secret that I was a walk-on. The story is, I grew up in a small town in Kansas. I'm from a town of 700 people called Meriden. And I was a really good high school basketball player. I played on some AAU teams that were pretty good, but the knock was he's just from this little tiny town. He plays against like 6'2" farm kids. Like it doesn't mean anything. I was getting some attention from like Ivy League schools and the University of Vermont and University of North Dakota and Lamar University. I was very close to going to Davidson. And in some ways, actually, there's a part of me that wonders what my life would be like if I had gone there, because Bob McKillop, who's the head coach, was such a good dude. Anyway, we at some point wrote letters. My dad convinced me to go to the Topeka Public Library and get the addresses of like 80 different college programs, right? And I just wrote letters to all of them. So I wasn't writing letters to like Kentucky, but I'd write letters to like Tennessee and Vanderbilt and places where I was like, they're Division I schools, but they're not great. I think I'm good enough to play at these places. And they almost all said no. Iowa State wrote back. Tim Floyd wrote a little card saying like, hey, you seem like a nice kid. Thanks for trying, but we don't have any spots. And then the University of North Dakota, who had been really like all in there, they were a Division II school at the time. They maybe are Division I now. I don't know. Okay. Their assistant coach, when I told them no, had been an assistant at Iowa State. He called Tim Floyd and said, hey, there's this kid that nobody knows about in this little tiny town in Kansas. You should take a look at him. So Tim Floyd got in touch and said, you seem like a good dude and you're pretty good at basketball, but we're still out of scholarships. So here's a contact to Southern Mississippi. They had an assistant coach that had gone to Southern Mississippi. Coach Floyd's old boy said, yeah, you can come to Southern Miss. But in the process of all this, my mom looked up Iowa State a little bit. I was a National Merit Scholar. And you can go to Iowa State for free if you're a National Merit Scholar. So we called Tim Floyd back and said, hey, would you like a guy for free? And he's like, yeah, of course, that'd be great. So I went as technically a walk-on, but my only condition was nobody could know that I was a walk-on, because I kind of knew just it's sort of like we were talking about earlier with like guys knowing so much about each other. I knew that would sort of put me behind when it comes to the way I was viewed. So yes, I'm kind of proud of the fact that I was a walk-on, but nobody at the time knew I was a walk-on because I thought that would be bad for PR.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. You wouldn't be on the same level playing field initially as the other guys coming in, so they may not view you as an equal.
Yeah, because you were sort of semi-jokingly saying, like, do you just show up? There are tryouts where they will have like walk-on tryouts, and everybody else would be like, haha, these are just the walk-ons. And I'd be over there like, well, I'm actually one of them. I didn't have to like go through that progression. But yeah, I was technically a walk-on. And now it's a point of pride, especially because you know who else was a walk-on at Iowa State is Jeff Hornacek.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've played against walk-ons. They're amazing. They're amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, as much as you slag off on I said I had a great seat at the end of the bench, you're still better than 99.9% of the people that are ever going to pick up a basketball.
Oh yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, I would, at a certain point, was among the top 300 or 400 people in the world at basketball.
The world.
Yeah. And it's also like, I mean, like you were saying about the walk-ons, the margins are pretty thin. I was probably in the top 300 or 400. I might have been in the top 200, but I might have only been in the top 1,000. It's hard to say. And similarly, like in college, we'd have days when, as I said, my junior year, we finished the year ranked like 3rd or 4th in the country. And we had days when the walk-ons would just kill us. They were just like, they'd be on and they were the like scout team. So they'd be running the other team's plays and we couldn't stop them because these are all guys who'd scored 20 a game in high school and they would connect on a day. They were a lot of times their main problem was that they were just like weirdly sized. They'd be like 6'2" when they need to be 6'5", or they would be 6'5" when they need to be 6'10", but they all knew how to play basketball. And that was true in the NBA too. Like, there's a lot of guys that would just flat out destroy some of the better players in the NBA if that guy isn't concentrating. Like the margin, if both guys are on, then the better player is going to win. But it doesn't take much of a slip for that guy who's like slightly worse to catch up to him.
I know it is impressive though, because then you see somebody that within the NBA, it's like, oh, they're up and down, whatnot, and they move to another league and so they're unstoppable. It's flat out unstoppable, and just that tiny little sliver of a difference makes it's tremendous. It's a quantum leap on some level. Yeah,
and a lot of the differences like development. Do certain guys just keep getting better? Certain guys figure out how their brains work, and that helps them a lot. It's these very small incremental differences.
Yeah, then there's I know you haven't been watching, but there's a guy named Christian Wood who's been floating around for years, and then now he's on the Rockets. That guy looks legitimate and somebody you could win a championship with long term after 7 years. Yeah, just like bouncing around, has been with a bunch of different teams, and then finally put it all together this year.
Yeah, and that's something that's another thing I think you'll start to see more of. There is in the analytics game, there's that sense of like, well, look, if a guy's not made it by the time he's 27, then he's not going to do it. But we're learning so much about the human body and also about like the psychology of sports that I think you'll start to see guys given, maybe they won't be given longer chances, but I think you'll be amazed at the way that we're able to develop people. When teams are smart, they'll be able to realize like my Kansas City Royals, right? They have this player named Whit Merrifield who was in the minors until 3 years ago. And now he's 32 or 33, something like that. But he's led the league in hits 2 years in a row. And it's because it took a long time to get to there. Like some of us, I really, really and truly was not physically ready to be at my best until I was 28 or 29. Like it just takes longer for some people. And I think an awareness of that will help certain teams.
Yeah. And hopefully, as you said, it bears out for players that they get a little bit more time to develop, but I don't know. We'll see. They still take them young. And now that they're going to let, high schoolers back into the draft, I would imagine it's going to be more difficult for somebody to hang around long enough if they don't show promise early on, especially if their high school kid got taken in the lottery. It's like, you need to produce in 4 years.
Yeah.
Which is, I can't even fathom what that's got to be like for an 18-year-old to go up against grown men. It doesn't make sense to me.
Wild.
Yeah. I didn't think I was an adult until 28. So
yeah. No, it's just like you can kind of, it's funny too, how I wish that they would train us to understand ourselves a little better, just athletically, because that's the subject we're talking about, but in all things, right? Like I think there was a point where I started to make sense of like, oh, my brain is actually working a lot better than it did when I was 25. And then physically the same kind of thing, like, oh wow, this stuff makes a lot more sense. I remember having that feeling when I was finishing my career in Spain, where I was like, man, I am not very tired out here. Does that mean I'm not working very hard? Then I look around, I'm like, oh no, it's because I know where to be. And like my body is just so much more hooked up. And so therefore I'm not using all of this energy that when I was 19, I was exhausted constantly because I was just frantically flying around.
Yeah, the game better now. It's like, oh, this guy's tendency to go here. So to prevent that, I'm going to shift to here, and just to save yourself. It's just, using your brain and basketball IQ. Well, I know you've got a heart out coming up.
I got to go run a thing for the process, which is this other thing I keep alluding to.
Well, thank you so much for joining today. It was good. I enjoyed
Great.
myself thoroughly.
Thank
I
you.
hope you did too.
I did. I appreciate getting the chance to tumble down memory lane a little bit. It's easy too when I don't really, there's no stakes, right? Like I don't know if you know who Justin Halpern is. We used to have a podcast called Short Corner where we would talk about the NBA, and because I didn't care, I was able to say things that like the average commentator can't. I'm always amazed, like when a commentator is clearly looking to worm his way back into a job, he then becomes a lot more PC. He's like, well, I don't know, that like, we should probably think of this from both angles.
Yeah.
And I think one of the fun things for me with basketball specifically is like, I'm just not ever really interested in getting back into it, so I can kind of let loose.
Well, I think that's evident,
Yeah,
and
makes it fun.
Yeah. Well, I mean, is there anything that you like to plug before we get out of here? I know Ball Boy just came out. Where can people pick that up?
On Mr. Bezos's site, or what used to be Mr. Bezos's site. Yeah, just go to Amazon. It's pretty good. I think if you're into basketball, you'll enjoy it. It's about basketball and also community. It's about a kid whose mother moves him from Reseda, California, to a small town in Kansas where he finds basketball as a way to fit in and feel special. It's sort of a reverse Karate Kid. In fact, Reseda is where Daniel LaRusso's mom takes him. So it's kind of like this reverse of that. And I'm pretty proud of it. It came out pretty well.
All right. Well, those, listening and watching, pick it up. Ball Boy. You can get that at Amazon. Is there a Kindle and audiobook version? There
is a Kindle. There is no audiobook this time. There's an audiobook. There's actually a podcast version of Stories I Tell on Dates. It's free. Okay. And I think it's one of, not necessarily because of things I've done, but the production is really, really cool. They were able to like almost turn it into sort of a audio play in a way.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, it's pretty fun.
Well, follow him at Paul Then Shirley on Twitter. Is that the same on Instagram as well?
It is.
All right. Well, hit him up over there. Thank you so much for taking the time and joining me today.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
All right. That is it for today's Dropping Dimes. We'll see you guys next week. Until then, stay safe out there and adios.